Where is this bill?
So where is this bill? This bill is H 403
It's in housing.
downstairs in the General and Housing Committee. And we're not planning to take possession of it this session anyway, but there's an argument for having us take a look at it. Representative Supernant, who introduced the bill, and we served on a committee that she's going to talk a little bit about last summer and fall. It was formed as a result of bill that we passed last year, S102, that called for, made several changes to labor law, and it called for a study committee to look at the exemption in our statutes that agricultural workers have from organizing, and also from some employment provisions like minimum wage. So that study group met over the fall. We made some recommendations. We haven't looked at the report. I think the folks downstairs may have looked at the report. Senate looked at the report, at least in one committee. Yeah, it seemed like before that all became too stale and too far in the past, it might be helpful just to have a bit of a conversation about it.
Who was Ledge counsel on that?
That was Sophie. So she's with us this morning, also drafted this bill. So after we hear from Heather, then we'll have Sophie just give us a walkthrough too.
Great. And I'll keep it fairly high level, but for the record, Representative Heather Supernant, and this will be a light introduction to H 403, which is an act relating to labor standards and housing for agricultural employees. This bill proposes to do three things: repeal the exemption of agricultural workers from minimum wage laws, provide overtime pay for agricultural workers, and provide inspections to determine the adequacy of farm employee housing. And before I dive into the more nuanced details of H 403 and their importance, I want to start by saying that this bill, as you just heard, was informed by my experience serving on the Agricultural Labor Study Commission this past summer and fall, which was created by the legislature. And after weeks of testimony from advocates, farm owners, and farm workers, as well as an in-depth review of Vermont's ag labor laws by our own Ledge Council, it became clear that there are areas of ag labor law that are in need of some serious updating. This bill seeks to strike a balance that wouldn't impact the financial solvency of farm owners, while also recognizing that in order to have a vibrant and sustainable agricultural economy, we must not only pay our farm workers fair wages, but we must also acknowledge the value of agricultural work for all the ways it contributes to healthy communities, rural economies, and our landscape. So what the bill actually does is it would ensure that farm workers are paid the state's minimum wage. And additionally, it would make workers eligible for overtime pay only if they exceed 60 hours a week at a time-and-a-half rate. We know farmers don't work the standard 9 to 5, 40-hour work week, so it was important that this be considered in the approach to ensuring farm workers are fairly compensated for their labor, but not at a pace that would threaten the financial stability of the farm and the farm owners themselves. The second part of this bill addresses a survey, and it's to be conducted by the Agency of Agriculture that will help to illuminate existing shortcomings or areas for improvement to employee farm housing. This survey will focus on the adequacy, availability, and safety of farm employee housing. The questions cover a wide range of matters relating to safety codes, repairs, privacy, and living conditions. And there is nothing in this bill that mandates farm employees to participate in the survey themselves, but the Secretary of Ag is tasked with conducting the survey during a regularly scheduled inspection. The surveys are then to be submitted by the Division of Fire Safety to inform whether the division should conduct an inspection of farm employee housing to determine whether or not it is safe for occupation. If the Division of Fire Safety conducts an inspection of farm employee housing, the division shall assess whether the farm employee housing satisfies the requirements of the Vermont Residential Rental Housing Health and Safety Code. If the housing is found to not be in compliance, farmers are given the chance to correct the issue prior to any penalty. And the bill itself would take effect on July 1st, 2025, but the overtime provision wouldn't take effect until January 2026. And what I didn't put in this bill, but I really wish that I had, was a provision that would connect the Secretary of Agriculture with and their farm owners with the Champlain Housing Trust, because they have a Vermont Farm Worker Housing Repair Loan Program. And I think that that could be a really helpful link when you're having farmers need to update their housing to also supply them with the funds to do so. And that's all.
Right, thank you. Do we have any questions? Representative Bosland.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering the time and a half for hours worked over 60 hours. I'm wondering how you came up with that. Like, I know, for example, some of the guest workers that come from Jamaica work really long hours seasonally, and then they go home for half the year. So how did you come up with the number 60? Like, would many of them be eligible for that? Would most people not be eligible for that? Is the idea that it's gonna encourage farmers not to have people work more than 60 hours? Like, how did you come up with that number?
I didn't come up with that. That was what we came up with in our study committee
Based
over the
on-
summer. Based on all of the varieties of farm workers, looking at seasonal, looking at long-term. But if you're thinking of some of those like H2A workers,
Yep.
they already have a specific set of work requirements that they are needing to be in compliance with. And
So this
typically
wouldn't
they're
apply
above
to
the
them,
state's
or it
minimum
wouldn't?
wage. They're at like 17, 18, 19 an hour versus some of the other workers that we're trying to make sure we're covering that we know are being missed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you. Representative Supernaut, I understand the wages part, and I think that a majority of the workers are paid far and above minimum wage, as they should be. The 60-hour thing is a little bit because a lot of these workers want to work X number of hours. By choice. Some of it's some of it's by choice.
Mhm.
I can't just speak to everybody. High school kids. If this were to go forward, I'd love to see a carve out for high school kids, because you're taking a young person, that is completely raw, and to pay them those types of wages with overtime could be problematic.
What do you mean by those types of wages?
Way over minimum wage with overtime. A lot of these young kids, we have 3 great high school kids that work for us, and they make a lot of money for someone that doesn't have a driver's license.
I think I personally would have a pushback to the idea of not demonstrating the worth of agricultural work at a young age. I think if we are trying to get young people into the field of agriculture, then we ought to demonstrate that it is a lucrative and financially viable position to be in. Otherwise, we're likely not going to get the next generation of farmers. We encourage a lot of kids to get into the trades, but not farming because there's no money in it. I think that's a really problematic narrative that we're weaving there. And I think that if we are trying to recognize that there are a lot of kids who likely come from a lot of different backgrounds, some of those kids might need to be more financially independent than you would really consider. So having at least minimum wage and the value of their labor being put at overtime, I think would probably be important, but there is really nothing in this bill that addresses that. Those are my own personal thoughts on the matter.
Yep. We can have vigorous debate about that at another time.
I welcome it.
But the part of housing. Without becoming an overbearing landlord, sometimes and sometimes the housing is a creation of the people living there. And I'm not and I'm talking about all housing. Some people live in a house and take care of it nicely. And some people live in a house and absolutely destroy it.
Mhm.
And so, and I realize there's no penalties with this and whatnot. I do appreciate what you're talking about housing. I'm just saying, in the real world, a lot of farmers could show you housing that, it started out like this, and after a year,
Mhm.
it looks like this.
Mhm. And I think that that is likely true, and I'm sure of that, but this is a very different issue that it's trying to cover. This is to make sure that employee housing has heat, running water,
Yeah.
adequate bedroom space,
Smoke detectors,
smoke detectors, yeah, just certain
Okay.
things that are
fair,
for housing codes, not necessarily an indictment of the ways in which people live within a space.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I'm sure that could be part of the conversation, just to understand what that's like
Yeah.
on the side of a landlord.
yeah,
Mhm.
okay, thank you.
Other questions, John?
So on that subject, like if I had an apartment to rent out, the state does a certain inspection, say,
Mhm.
do they not have to do the same inspection of farm worker housing?
I don't know, I'm gonna lean on Sophie for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other thing is, the other question I had was, say comparing to H2A workers or maybe even waiters, the sort of types of workers who don't, there's some sort of compensation involved,
Mhm.
like housing is with farm workers oftentimes.
Mhm.
Is there any data on like, what does your average Vermont farm worker make if housing's, say pulled out of that, like H2A workers, they get housing and they make a very specific wage.
Yeah, we heard all about that during the summer study commission, and I don't know if it would be easier just to share that document with you. I mean, those are fairly extensive,
Speak to
or if you have the exact numbers of breakdowns for all the categories, but yeah, that is available.
Okay.
Mhm.
Great.
All right, should we have Sophie come up then?
Good morning. My first time in this committee. It's very nice to meet you all.
Welcome.
So I'm Sophie Zadatny with the Office of Legislative Counsel. I started back in October, so I was not the original Legislative Counsel on the study committee, but then sort of phased in starting in October and then worked on the report. And the report is available on the website, and we can certainly make sure that you all get that. I would say the report, what we tried to do with the report was capture as much of the information that was provided as possible, so that if and when the General Assembly was ready to, decide what to do around agricultural workers, they weren't just starting, from scratch, like they had a resource that they could look at to start working from. So I provided several handouts, which I think Linda has circulated to all of you. So I'm just going to quickly share those with you. So one is the bill, which I can certainly put up on the screen. The second one was a matrix that was from the report, and this was a state-by-state comparison of employment laws for agricultural workers. It's Appendix 4 to the report, but it lists the states that exclude or include agricultural workers receiving state minimum wage, and then state overtime. I will say on the state minimum wage, the one thing to bear in mind is that state minimum wage varies wildly. So some states are at the federal rate, which is $7.25, which is the low end. And that's a floor. So some states may have lower than that, but the federal would control. And then other states go up, significantly more. So I just thought that might be helpful background information for you. This is a fact sheet, a Vermont Farm Employee fact sheet that's available on the Agency of Agriculture's website. It's a little out of date. It references the Vermont hourly, a minimum wage right now is $13.18. It's actually $14.01 as of January 1, 2025 this year. And then it also has a list of the deductions that can be made from an employee's wages on page 8. And again, that's from 2023. So the final piece of paper I gave you was this from the Department of Labor, which sets out the room and board deductions for this year, 2025. So one of the things that the committee heard about was that you can charge, as an employer, if you're providing housing, you can charge room and board to your employees, but it is capped at that. I would say the amounts are relatively modest, the amounts. So I would just share with that as a starting point. And Representative Superintendent already kind of stole my thunder in terms of an overview, but we'll dive in here. So let me just get this up on the screen. And then as was noted, this bill is looking to repeal the current exemption of agricultural workers from the applicability of the minimum wage law and to provide overtime pay. So I think it's important to understand that agricultural workers, dating back to the 1930s when the Fair Labor Standards Act came in at the federal level, agricultural workers and domestic workers were both two categories of workers that were excluded from coverage by the Fair Labor Standards Act. And that kind of has carried over into state law. So Vermont excludes agricultural workers from receiving the state minimum wage. So right now, agricultural workers in Vermont are required to be paid the federal minimum wage of $7.25, but are not required to receive the state minimum wage. And in addition to which, agricultural workers are also excluded from receiving overtime. So for most people, under both federal and state law, if you work more than 40 hours a week and you're not a professional, you're not an exempt employee, you receive time and a half in wages. So just by way of background, it's important to understand that for agricultural workers. And then as discussed, the other section of the bill was really to provide a mechanism whereby there was some data gathered around employee housing for agricultural workers, and to make sure that that was done in a way that was sort of minimally obtrusive, but there was, sort of piggyback on existing inspections, and then providing surveys to employees to complete. And then again, if there are problems identified, then that would go over to the Division of Public Safety, the fire division that actually implements, the rental housing codes, to then determine whether or not they would do an inspection. So it wouldn't be the agricultural inspectors doing the inspection of the housing. They would just be doing the surveying, and then the survey would go over to the fire division. And again, right now in Vermont, it's a complaint-driven process. So if somebody has a complaint about their housing, that then usually triggers an inspection. There aren't people going out doing sort of spot checks on that.
Representative Nelson.
No, thank you. Looking at the room and board fees, housing fees. As we can see, wages have gone up almost $1 an hour from 23 to now. Where was that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, room fees have gone up, $7 a week, for full room and board. If you add up board for a week, it's $90, but full room and board's only $109. So they're thinking that room is only worth $19 for a full week. For housing, and a lot of it is housing, not room and board. It's easy to see why it's hard to make money farming when we're not fully compensated for what we're providing. We have some employees that live in a ranch house. They're paid over minimum wage, and they live in a ranch house that we think that a rent value is of, you know, $1,000 a week. And, but in the open market, that rent value would be $1,500 a week. A month, excuse me, a month. So I just, just want to make that statement on the values placed on room and board and, house.
Okay, thank you. John?
So how does, healthcare, everybody in Vermont is required to have healthcare. How does that figure into ag worker?
We didn't address that through the committee, so there wasn't any discussion around that. So I think that would be up to individual employers as to whether they're providing that or not. So I don't have any additional information.
And benefits too, as far as, sick days and holidays.
Sick days, they are covered by, and again, if you look on the Vermont Farm Employee Fact Sheet, I think that covers a lot of those questions. But I believe there is sick leave is one of the things that's provided. I'm not saying it off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure it isn't in here. I know it's in the report. So yeah, I'm not seeing it right here, but it's in the report. I believe they qualify as, so again, under a lot of Vermont state laws around employees are defined differently under different statutes. But I believe they're covered by the paid sick days that are provided in Title 21. Right, so the short title of the act would be Agricultural Workers Fair Labor Standards and Housing Act. And then Section 2, the way this works, this is the minimum wage part of Title 21, is it defines employee, but right now it excludes any individual employed in agriculture, and it has a list of other exclusions as well. So what this bill would do is limit that exclusion for individuals employed in agriculture to only exclude individuals who actually are the parent, spouse, or child of the agricultural employer. So in other words, it would allow other ones that are not family members to receive minimum wage. So by adjusting the definition, that's the impact of what that would provide. Section 3, I just put in there just so people are aware of what the minimum wage is. So this is the current calculation of minimum wage that Vermont uses under Section A1. And then under B is where the overtime. So again, if an employee, and again, there are a list of exclusions of employees like professional employees, that are considered exempt, but other employees receive time and a half if they work more than 40 hours a week. And so what this bill proposes to do is to say that any individual employed in agriculture, provided the employee receives not less than 1.5 times the regular wage rate for any work done by the employee in excess of 60 hours per week. And there was a question about why 60 hours a week. And again, if you look at the state by state summary, there are a number of states that have started providing overtime to agricultural workers. And typically the mechanism they've done that with is by starting at 60 hours a week and then gradually decreasing it. So it might be 60 hours for 2 years and then 56 hours and then 52 hours, and the goal being to get down to 40 hours a week. So for example, in New York State, that's what they're doing. They're phasing it in, I think, until 2032. But what they're also doing in New York is they have set aside funding to compensate farmers for the amount that they're paying in overtime. Not if they're paying overtime above 60 hours, but as it decreases, they get a tax credit for the amount of overtime they're paying. When it goes to 56 hours, for example, that 4 hours thing they would be getting a tax credit for. So there are mechanisms in other states where they've looked at how to phase it in. So in California, they phased it in on a different time schedule depending on the size of the farm. So there are different mechanisms, but there aren't a lot of states that provide overtime for agricultural workers. But the handful that do, 60 is kind of where they have started. Again, understanding how, a different kind of workplace being on a farm is compared to, sitting in an office. And then the next Section 4 would be adding a new chapter into the agricultural title of Vermont law. And so again, it has definitions. It's the first section here. And then this talks about the adequacy of farm employee housing. So when the secretary, and again, this is the Secretary of Agriculture, Food and Markets, is doing a scheduled inspection of a farm under Chapter 215, which is the water quality, the secretary shall determine if farm employee housing is in use on the farm. And if so, then they'll survey the farm employees regarding the adequacy, availability, and safety of the farm employee housing. And then subsection B sort of talks a little bit more about the survey. So there'll be a standard form with questions, and then the form at a minimum will include these questions A through G. So is the farm employee housing provided voluntarily? Are you required to be housed on the farm? Was it provided in clean working order? Is it being properly and timely maintained? Do you pay rent? If you pay rent, does it reduce your net wages? Do you have sleeping areas with doors or the ability to maintain privacy? And then asking about heat, safety, ventilation, windows, and temperature control. And those are all issues that came up in the testimony before the study committee as being the challenges that some farm employees are encountering. So again, there would be a requirement that the form that's provided to employees, that they can understand it so it's accessible. So whether that's providing the form in multiple languages or making sure there's interpretation or translation services available to help the farm employee complete the form. And then if there's an administrative penalty, if a farm employer is obstructing the ability of the employees to complete the survey. And then once the survey is completed, then those would be shared with the Division of Fire Safety. And again, they would then evaluate the surveys to determine whether or not the housing being provided is safe for occupation, and they can go in and do an inspection. And then again, the Vermont Residential Rental Housing Health and Safety Code that applies to farm employee housing. And then again, if there's violations, they give them an opportunity to fix the violations. And if they fail to do so, then there's an administrative penalty. So that is the sum total of the act right now.
The agency, the secretary is the Secretary of Agriculture.
Right.
Secretary then is collecting forms from the employees after the survey forms after they've been completed. And then if there's a concern, we pass it on to fire safety folks.
Right.
If there isn't a concern, what is the agency doing with the information they've collected?
I think that I don't know if they just send them all regardless. Let me just double check on that. Yeah, it says a copy of each form submitted by a farm employee to the secretary under this section shall be submitted to the Division of Fire Safety. So they'll all go over there. And then the Division of Fire Safety will assess whether we'll do an inspection and then assess whether it satisfies the code requirements.
So that's one possible outcome. But are there other possible outcomes here? What would the agency do with the rest of the data that they're collecting?
The Secretary of Agriculture, this doesn't specify what they would do with that. I assume it probably would be helpful to have data, because I think one of the issues that the study committee confronted was a lack of data on a number of issues and then conflicting data on other issues. So I would say there were certainly some committee members that felt they didn't have enough information and wanted the committees of jurisdiction to spend more time delving into some of the issues that were raised.
You've reached the end of the bill. There's an effective date of July 1.
Assume would need to be adjusted at this point.
Okay, great. Questions, other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just looked it up and it looks like they haven't done much with it in House General. Is your expectation that they're thinking about it for next year? Do we have any idea of the viability of it downstairs?
I don't know the viability of it downstairs. I introduced the bill to the committee.
Yeah.
I think that there were perhaps slight musings that our committee would take a stronger look at it, since it really is quite relevant to us. But apart from that, I don't know.
Would it make sense for us to request it?
Yeah, so if the committee felt that it wanted to do something, they could request it. They may take it up next year.
It's of interest to me, and I was looking like, oh, how close is it to passing out? And it looks like it hasn't gone anywhere.
Yes,
So,
they haven't taken any testimony. I don't think even Sophie.
There was an introduction, I think, by Representative Supernaut, but I did not do a walkthrough.
Yeah.
down
Yeah,
there.
if you get a chance when you're walking past, look at their board and you'll see.
yeah, housing has a
And
very.
you can't even read, they're overlapped, they're tiled.
Yeah,
They have so many bells in that wall.
yeah, we should talk about that.
When did you present this?
Oh, about a month ago?
February 27th, I think it shows.
Oh my God, so many months ago. I don't know what day it is. Yeah.
Uh, The, yeah, the issue that I think Richard was getting at with the deduction that a farmer can take from wages to cover housing. That maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because right now, so right now, we know that there are some farm workers who do get housing. It's in part of the deal, and some of those are seasonal workers, and some of them are not. And if you're currently deducting the value of the housing, do you have to use the numbers that are on this? Is that for any farm worker housing?
My understanding is that that's sort of the maximum that you can deduct.
Okay,
Oh,
Richard.
it's not so much an deduction as it's an addition to, so they're working for X number of dollars per hour, which in most cases is above minimum wage, not the high school kids, but the other people far and above minimum wage, plus they get housing.
So at least in your situations that you're familiar with, they get housing for free. It's not, there's no deduction from
No
there.
deduction, no taxes, no, whereas if you deducted it from them, there would probably be taxes paid. It would be, net, come off the net. So it's one of those benefits that I believe that farmers have been able to do. And when I find it insulting to be put in at $109 a week when the hotel motel program pays out $125 a night. I just find it.
Where do those numbers come from, Sophie?
Yeah, the Department of Labor, the Commissioner of Labor puts it out.
So this is our state Department of Labor.
Yeah.
It's a number that they're saying to farmers specifically.
No, it's just generally, but it's the amount an employer is entitled to deduct from the wages earned.
If they provide housing.
Yeah, so they're not required to deduct it, but
Yeah.
they're entitled to deduct up to that amount. And then it increases along with, I believe they increase it in the same way that they do the minimum wage. So it gets adjusted by the same amount, percentage wise.
I think that the reaction we had when the committee looked at this number in the fall, we were surprised at how small a number it was. That was, I think when we first heard that, there's housing and then heard, in some cases, employees get housing and then heard, and the farmer can deduct the value of that from their paycheck. That sounded like that could be a problem because housing we know is expensive. And if you were providing housing and then saying, I'm going to take that amount off of your paycheck, that could be have quite an impact. And then we saw that, well, actually can't have a huge impact because they can only take off this much maximum, $30 a week or whatever it is. And so that was a relief on the one hand, but on the other hand, yes, it seems like it's surprisingly small that that's considered the value of the housing that people are getting.
Was that to avoid a sort of company town type of situation where you get paid a certain amount and then,
Script.
Yeah,
to the
exactly.
Company store.
yeah,
I don't know what the historical background is, but yeah, I anticipate it's right. So you're not sort of effectively in bondage because, right.
yeah.
And then, do you remember, we heard some testimony on what wages people were actually paying. Do you remember well enough, and it's in the report, but to summarize what we heard?
That folks are paying?
Yeah, what typical wages were, just for in relation to minimum wage?
You mean when farm owners came in and shared testimony about what they were?
Or
paying?
farm workers, yeah.
Well, those felt a little different, so I'm not entirely sure that I would summarize that myself.
Okay, well,
The sense was that there wasn't reliable data. So the Migrant Justice had done a survey. They had about 200, as I recall, about 200 workers had completed a survey. And the ranges were, I would say, like maybe $8 to $15 an hour. It was, varied. And then there was some information from the Vermont Dairy Producers Alliance. And that indicated that they were paying a lot more. And then this issue around, well, that there could be these deductions kind of came in, but their testimony was, labor is very tight. It's very hard to find people. So we're paying well above minimum wage. So that was the challenge for the committee, was that they were getting pretty different pictures of how much people were making.
And was it the case that we heard testimony that, for example, teenagers who live in town are maybe not paid as much as migrant farm workers who are adults?
I don't recall there being any testimony about teenagers. There was testimony around, and again, people get so confused. I'm sure you guys don't, because you deal with this a lot more, but between migrant workers and undocumented workers, and they're very different. So migrant workers really are the H-2A workers that are coming in, come seasonally. They're regulated very extensively at the federal level in terms of the hours they can work. And to the point earlier, there was certainly testimony that those H-2A workers, they want to work as many hours as possible in order to take the maximum amount back home with them.
They get over there? Do they?
I don't believe they do, but there was, I know this was an issue that came up in New York when New York was looking at, phasing in overtime. There was testimony in New York around H-2A workers not being happy about it because they felt that would restrict the number of hours their employer would have them work, and they wanted to work as many hours as possible. So, and again, they're paid a much higher rate. So I think, you just hear sort of migrant workers used as a term, and that's, those workers are, are pretty well regulated and supported through the federal immigration program. It's the other side is really more on the undocumented workers, which was really where the concerns were coming up around housing and pay and things like that.
The H-2A visa program, it requires employers to pay a wage based on the prevailing area wage, I think.
Right.
So it's not decided by the farmer, right? They have to follow whatever
And it was,
the data shows.
as of last year, it was like in the $17, $18 range.
$18.
Yeah.
Those are workers who are at orchards picking seasonally.
Us too.
Yeah.
And that was the other piece of testimony, was that H-2A workers are not typically working on dairy farms because that's a year-round operation. And so they really are coming only for those sort of seasonal jobs.
Which is unfortunate and a big federal problem, obviously.
Exactly.
But I mean, legally,
Explain why it's.
The workers who are not authorized to be there working, who are on Vermont's dairy farms, are living in the shadows and are afraid they're going to be deported. I'd say that's
So it's smart.
very good.
Okay. I
Because
thought
they
you were talking
can't-
about the H2A.
Yeah, they can't get, there's no visa program for them because the programs that do exist are only for seasonal work, and dairy work is not seasonal, it's daily.
It's things I don't like to talk about on the hot mic. Unfortunately.
But I was just gonna say legally, like Nelson Farms could pay federal minimum wage, $7 an hour, and then deduct the housing.
Yes.
That'd be criminal.
I'm sure it's done in some places.
Uh,
Yeah, the deduction can take you below minimum wage.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's still obviously a market for labor that I don't claim to have an understanding of at all. Maybe others do, but at some point, presumably you wouldn't get people who are willing to do the work because the wage is too low, given the risks involved for that hard work.
Can we just ask Richard, like, you must know, I mean, worker wise, farms, it must sort of level out at some point. Like if Nelson Farm was paying so much and Chappetts or Pleasant Valley was paying a lot more, you would have migration there, right?
They all have one of these.
Yeah.
They are highly connected and we're all within pennies. We're all within pennies, except for high school kids.
Isn't that collusion? Isn't that?
It is, no, it's
Fair market, yeah.
it's fair market. It's fair market. I came in last year to testify before the committee. And while I was here, there was collective bargaining going on at the farm with give and take. And everybody walked away happy. You know, there was a raise given and there were concessions made by labor to allow for this or that, and there was a wage given, and like I said, everybody walked away happy. And it just happened to be, I was here, sitting in what, I think it was it might have been the summertime committee.
Yeah, well, we definitely had, yeah, I think we had you in the, it was actually in fall by the time we got around to it, but yeah.
Yeah, and I, in my role at the farm, I'm not connected with that part of it. And I didn't know what was going on and I came out, and called home. I said, what's happening? And I said, oh, we just got done our union session, and as we lightly call it. But, you know, we all get together, we buy pizza and sodas and everyone sits around the room. We have a wonderful guy that comes in and interprets. And a lot of the, you know, people speak English, but we get an interpreter too, just to remove all doubt and questions and you know, it works.
Everybody was glad Richard wasn't there.
No, that's fine. I have immense respect for those fellas. When you can walk through a pen of 400 cows and you have to weave your way through them because your people handle your cattle so respectfully, the cows don't run from you. If you don't have deep respect for those people, you have something wrong with you. And all our cows, I have to walk through them like this, that they don't run from you. And 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that probably wasn't the case. And these fellows are professionals, and every meaning of the word, they're professionals. And heck, they shouldn't be H2A, they should be H1B.
And what's the difference?
H1B are for people with college degrees. And I'm telling you, these young, you know, these people we have working for us, they set the bar high. They're
It's a
just,
skilled worker
they
category.
are very skilled workers.
H2B is,
H1B.
that's like skiers and like carnival workers, fair workers.
Yeah, I mean, I think H2A is specifically agricultural seasonal
Right.
workers.
'Cause we had problems with, I think, H2B with the fairs a couple of years ago. There was a moratorium on those things, so that was gonna be a big problem for the vendors who do rides at fairs.
Right, okay.
Over the
Different
years, I think
categories.
there's been, caps and
Right.
a number of federal
Exactly.
across the country, yeah. And Sophie, is there anything else to say about the bill? So thank you for putting all this information together.
I can send around the link to the report if that's helpful. And
Yeah,
then in the
I'd like to-
report, there are links to the other materials that the committee considered. So, there was again, the survey from Migrant Justice, there's other links in there, so.
You send out the link to, and she can post it on our
Okay.
page for the day. Good, all right,
Where do labor bills generally go?
they go to the general.
They do.
Yeah.
And they do housing too,
Yeah.
right? So they get
So I guess it's
both of these, yeah.
This one, there's whether there's a crossover.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, any other thoughts or questions? Discussion? All right, I guess we can take a break then, or I mean, we'll wrap up for the morning.
We have a vote at some point on whether we request the bill.
No, if we're interested in getting the bill, then I can just talk to, if that's a sense, and we can talk to Mark and
Okay.